We're going to start by talking about the selection of the researchable problem and the development of the research question. This is the most important step in the research process because if our problem isn't viable and testable, then the entire process is in vain. Our research problem selected should relate to an area of practice that we're interested in. The problem should also contribute to evidence-based practice, and it also needs to lend itself to either the development of a hypothesis or a research question. There are 5 components that indicate a research question is rooted in evidence-based practice. Number 1 is the researcher identified a patient group or condition. Number 2, an issue or intervention was under investigation. Number 3, there's a specific manner for baseline measurement and method for comparison. Number 4, an outcome or result is indicated. And number 5, there's a time frame required for the intervention to achieve the outcome. A PICO question is an acronym that will help us to make sure that we met these criteria. So RP stands for that specified patient or target population. The I is the issue or the intervention being investigated. C is the comparison being made. O is the outcome that might be the result. And T is the time frame. And our research problem can arise from a variety of situations. It might just be a subject matter that we personally have an interest in. It can also maybe be something that we observe as clinicians and we wonder, is that a coincidence or is there more to it? Also, sometimes research studies can be a source. Typically at the end of them, they will have areas where further research is recommended, and some researchers might go off of that information and look deeper into that as well. When formulating a research question, there are several questions that you need to ask yourself. The first is the research question one that non-nurses could understand? You want your research to be appealing to as big of an audience as possible, and this also increases the chances of your research being published. Number 2, is the answer to the research question not already obvious? If the answer is obvious, then the problem doesn't have a researchable basis. 3, do I have sufficient time to answer the research question? If it requires an indefinite amount of time, then this is not a practical research problem. And also, do I have the financial and personal resources that I need? If you don't have the manpower and you don't have the required funding, then again, it's not going to be a practical research problem. Next, we're going to talk about the appropriate use of a research question. For exploratory and descriptive studies, a research question is typically used as opposed to a hypothesis. This design is used when there is a lack of literature in the area of interest. Findings can then provide the basis for further research and hypotheses. In exploratory research, the researcher is trying to gain knowledge regarding the subject being investigated so that more research questions and hypotheses can be made. So these studies are used when working with new ideas that haven't been extensively investigated yet. In contrast, descriptive studies focus on ideas that may have been previously researched so that more research questions and hypotheses can be generated. The appropriate use of a hypothesis. A hypothesis is typically used for research other than the exploratory or descriptive designs that we just spoke of. So a hypothesis is like a prediction that the researcher makes. This prediction is in regards to the variables being studied. So these variables are either independent or dependent variables. The independent leads to the effect produced in the dependent variable. So, for example, if the researcher were studying the likelihood of a DNP student having a mental breakdown from trying to figure out Prezi for the first time, Figuring out Prezi would be the independent variable, which led to the effect, in this case, the mental breakdown, which is the dependent variable. Our next step is developing a testable hypothesis. Hypotheses serve three purposes for the researcher. The first is to provide a connection between theory and then the real world that the patient is in. Two, to advance knowledge of the researcher through potential new discoveries they might find. And three, to provide a direction for the research project by identifying possible anticipated outcomes of their research. The dependent variable that we just spoke about is what generates the hypotheses. There are several characteristics of acceptable hypotheses. The first is a relationship statement. This identifies the predicted relationship of the variables. The hypothesis should also specify the variables under investigation, the population under study, and the predicted outcome. The next element is testability. This just means that the variables can be observed, measured, and analyzed. More specifically, if the data has been collected and analyzed accurately, the hypotheses will then be supported or they're going to be not supported. Once the hypothesis is tested, the outcome proposed will be congruent with the actual outcome that occurs, or it'll be different. A hypothesis can fail testability if the researcher didn't predict the anticipated outcome, hasn't utilized observable or measurable variables, or failed to use objective phrases in the wording of the hypothesis. A hypothesis can also either be directional or non-directional. A directional hypothesis specifies the predicted direction of the relationship between the variables. A non-directional hypothesis, as you can probably guess, indicates the existence of a relationship between variables but doesn't specify which direction. A hypothesis can also be statistical or a research hypothesis. The research hypothesis consists of a statement about the expected relationship among the variables and indicates what the outcome is expected to be. The hypothesis is supported if statistically significant findings are obtained. The statistical or null hypothesis states that there's no relationship between the variables. If a statistically significant relationship is found, however, then the null is rejected and the research hypothesis is then accepted. Another element is if the hypothesis is consistent with existing body of knowledge and sound scientific rationale. When talking about using a theoretical or conceptual framework, it's important to remember that nursing theory, practice, and research are all interrelated. Theoretical and conceptual frameworks are often used interchangeably, those terms. The difference is concept is a mental image of an idea, and then theories are made up of interrelated concepts. Nursing literature frequently uses the terms grand theory, mid-range theory, and micro-range theory. A grand theory is very abstract. It establishes a knowledge base, so typically these concepts are things such as person, health, environment. Mid-range theories, they incorporate nursing practice and research into ideas that are important to our discipline. And then micro-range theories, these are kind of like a hypothesis. They include concepts linked to form a statement that we're going to examine further. The next step is to select a framework that will provide direction for the study. To pick the appropriate framework, the researcher will determine if they will be using deductive or inductive reasoning. The answer to this determines if a conceptual or a theoretical framework should be used. So if the researcher picks inductive reasoning, then they're going to start with the details from their experiences and practice and move towards a general picture. However, if they chose deductive reasoning, then they start with the general picture or theory and then they move towards direction for practice. If a theoretical framework is chosen, the researcher then will select the type of theory that will serve as the basis of the framework, from those that we talked about earlier. So either a grand, a mid-range, or a micro-range theory. The selection of an appropriate framework is very important to the study. The conceptual framework will be a theory model of the idea you intend to study and will help you set goals throughout the project. There should be a clear connection between the conceptual framework and the research problem. The conceptual framework can come from a couple different sources. The first could be the student's own experiences. The second could be existing theories and already published research studies. The third can come from a pilot study if the student did one. And then the fourth could be their own plausible explanation for the issue that they're studying.